Hi everyone. I'm doing this video just to talk a little bit about the Heritage and Stabilization Fund because a lot of people have reached out to me expressing views and concerns around the fact that the government looks to amend the legislation, meaning amending the fiscal rules that govern the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Now, remember that the Heritage and Stabilization Fund was designed for two purposes. The heritage purpose is really for longer term investment to ensure intergenerational equity, meaning that the future generations of Trinbagonians can enjoy the wealth that we've derived from the energy sector because they are just as entitled to that wealth as we are and as previous generations were. The stabilization element is basically funds that are available to the government in a time of need where their energy revenue does not meet their budgeted energy revenue. And so instead of having fiscal revenue from energy go up and down and be volatile, which then has implications for the wider economy, you want to be able to smooth out, or as the word implies, stabilize fiscal revenue and therefore fiscal spending. Now, in the first place, these two priorities or imperatives really imply that the fund was supposed to be split in two. And incidentally, for a long time, the legislation was supposed to be passed to split the fund into the Heritage and Stabilization, two separate funds. And I find it interesting that we never found the time and space to pass that legislation to split the fund in two, but now all of a sudden overnight we can amend the legislation to allow the Minister of Finance to access the fund outside of the fiscal rules that were enshrined or are enshrined in the existing legislation. Now those rules, there are rules around how money is deposited into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund and how money is withdrawn from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Under no circumstances is the Minister of Finance supposed to be able to access the Heritage and Stabilization Fund until the end of the fiscal year, when he is able to determine whether there has been a shortfall in revenue from the energy sector and the extent of that shortfall. And he is then allowed to take a prescribed proportion of that shortfall from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Not the whole shortfall, a proportion of the shortfall. And I don't want to get into the details of it. My point is that these safeguards were put in place for a reason. They were put in place to safeguard this fund so that we have a nest egg, we have buffers. And there are some who will argue, well, what's the point of buffers if COVID-19 is going to kill all of us? There is no point to buffers, and that we need to save what we can save now and stop the bloodshed now and bloodletting or whatever the case is, and stop the chaos now, save businesses, save people's lives, save everything. And I agree with the notion that the government needs to throw everything they can at this crisis. However, there are many ways that the government can access financing to throw everything they can at this crisis. They can borrow TT dollars domestically. They can borrow US dollars domestically. We have over $3 billion US dollars in the domestic banking system. They can go to the IMF and borrow. The IMF has earmarked special funds to help countries respond to this crisis. So it's not related to an IMF program. This is exceptional rapid funding. They could go to the IDB for the same thing, and they also have exceptional funding available. And they can go to CAF, which also has exceptional funding available. So the development banks and the multilateral lending institutions are there to lend us. And then they can also raise bonds, and they can go to the banking system and borrow money. There is excess liquidity in the banking system. They borrow. The government can borrow, and the banks can lend insofar as their concentration limits are adhered to. So my point is that the Heritage and Stabilization Fund should not be the first line of attack or defense, as the case may be. The Heritage and Stabilization Fund is there and should be accessed within the fiscal rules. We should not be breaking these fiscal rules. we should not be amending these fiscal rules. And I feel like when we use a crisis to do things like this, when we already have weak institutions, we already have weak governance, even that Heritage and Stabilization Fund is supposed to be reviewed periodically. I believe it's every 5 or 7 years. It has only been reviewed once. Even that HSF already is not being treated the way it's supposed to be treated. We already have all of these weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our governance in Trinidad and Tobago. I feel the last thing we should do is dismantle the safeguards that were put around the Heritage and Stabilization Fund now. There's so much more we can do before we go there. We should not go there first. I am appealing to the opposition leader. I'm appealing to the business leaders. I'm appealing to anybody who has a voice and cares to use it. Please let us say something and do something to prevent this from happening. If they amend the legislation that dismantles the safeguards around the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, I would bet this is a slippery slope. We would never go back, and they will never put those safeguards back in. Please let us do something, please. Thank you.